All right, guys, you guys are welcome back to your seats. I want to introduce. There we go. I just want to introduce Pastor C.R. Wiley to you guys. My introduction, actually, now that I was just thinking about this, I was walking down the hallway. My introduction to Pastor C.R. Wiley's work began right around the same time as my Bitcoin journey began. And so I was telling him this, his work has definitely affected the way that I think about Bitcoin. It's definitely affected the way that I see the world and see God's word. And so I am, again, thrilled that you guys get to be, get to hear him speak. We reached out to him I believe it was a number of months ago. Actually, I don't know if you remember this. I sent him in the end of 2020, I sent him a manuscript of Thank God for Bitcoin. And he was gracious enough. He wrote back right away. And I don't know if you actually read it, but you're like, hey, this is interesting. Again, weird guy talking about Bitcoin at that point. Now we have way more credibility now, all this kind of stuff. So no, we're grateful to have Pastor Wiley here with us. He's the author of Man of the House, The Household in the War for the Cosmos, In the House of Tom Bombadil. Do you guys sense a theme growing here? So he's really focused a lot on the household, focused on men. And so we are thrilled to have him here. He's actually got a number of other irons in the fire right now, including, again, I have 4 kids, so probably the thing that he's working on that I'm the most interested in is this kids book. It's called Daisy, based on your daughter. And so again, he goes on Facebook Live and posts him just videos of him drawing the illustrations for this book. And you cannot, it's just like one of these people, you're like, how can this person be so ridiculously talented in all these different ways? I'm like, what is going on here? So again, we're grateful for him as well. So Pastor Chris, come on and share with us. So.
All right. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Do you mind if I move the laptop?
No, go for it.
Okay. If I close it, is it a problem? Here, I'll just hand it down to you there, Jordan. Well, I'm honored to be with you folks. You are out there. The lights prevent me from seeing you. But I've been looking forward to this since I've been asked to speak. And everything looking okay? Okay. All right. And I don't preach from a manuscript. I barely use an outline. But when I speak at an event like this, I do use a manuscript. And the reason I do so is, obviously, I don't want to forget what I had to say. But I also want to make it available to anybody who cares to have it. So there's going to be a PDF that I'll share with Jordan. And then if you want to have it, you can have it. I won't even charge you anything for it. Anyway, I imagine people looking on and even in this room wonder what a pastor has to say about currency in general and Bitcoin in particular. If you're one of them, I don't blame you. These days, pastors tend to specialize in getting people into heaven and leaving other matters to the people who specialize in those things. But there are at least 2 problems with this. The first is, historically, pastors were not specialists in the sense that people mean by the term today. Along with philosophers and theologians, our proper object of study is reality itself, because God is ultimately real. I suppose that means we specialize in being a certain sort of generalist. We believe that the world is God's creation, and that Christ isn't so much an escape hatch from it as he is the one who redeems it and sets it right. Since I'm a spokesman for Christ, I'm just as interested in bringing heaven to earth as I am in getting people into heaven. And that means bringing heaven to bear on everything we find in the world, including money. But there's another reason. Some things are everyone's business, whether they want them to be or not. Psychology, for example, is such a thing. We're surrounded by other people, at least when we're not on social media. And we have to work with people whether we like them or not. That means we have to think about ourselves and others and try to understand why we do the things that we do. Ipso facto, that makes us all amateur psychologists, whether we love psychology or not, or whether we even like people or not. Or consider theology. There's no getting out of it. We all have convictions about God, whether we can articulate them or not, or even if we believe in him or not. And for the purpose of this talk, we're all economists. Every day we make judgments about value, the value of this or that, whether we like to or not, or whether we're good at it or not. Is the car overpriced? Should I buy it? Is it worth putting in overtime at the office if it makes me late for Timmy's birthday party? And so forth. I think you see what I mean. Recalling Richard Nixon, we're not all Keynesians now. We're all economists, and we've always been economists. By the way, the study of value has a name. It's called axiology. It's a branch of philosophy. I taught philosophy for about a decade at the college level, so I'm familiar with what I'm getting into. Things like metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, those are related to axiology. In fact, axiology is something of a hybrid, blending all those things and throwing in aesthetics for flavor, and that's because the study of value really is the study of what's really real. You'll see what I mean soon, I hope. Philosophers make a valuable distinction between what is intrinsically valuable and what is only extrinsically so. It's not difficult to see what they mean. Something that is intrinsically valuable is something worth having for its own sake. Extrinsically valuable things are useful for acquiring other things of value. Intrinsically valuable things are easy to identify. How about happiness, or friendship, or eternal salvation? As I noted, extrinsically valuable things are good to have, but primarily because they help us acquire other things. And here is where currency comes into the picture. It's often defined as a means of exchange or a store of value, but I think that you can see how confusion can arise from the fact that it's both. Because currency is valuable, we can mistake it for something that is intrinsically valuable. The Lord had some shrewd things to say on the subject because he had a nose for true value. When it comes to my favorite parable, this parable might surprise you. It's the parable of the shrewd manager found in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Here's how it goes. He also said to his disciples, and of course the he here is Jesus, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in an account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So, summoning his master's debtor, one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. The one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. The one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. While every parable is subtle, this one is especially so because the protagonist is an anti-hero. Nevertheless, we're all supposed to emulate him. But what are we supposed to emulate or imitate? His dishonesty or something else? This is where you have to be shrewd yourself and a little street smart if you're going to get the point. The first thing is easy to see. Friends in need are valuable because they're friends indeed. And it is wise to use what you have to make them. But the real point, the one implicit in the story, is this: we really are that manager, whether we know it or not, or whether we're shrewd or not. That's because we're playing with house money. It all belongs to God. And here's the punchline. The house wants us to use its wealth for things that are truly valuable. Or as philosophers like to say, we should exchange extrinsically valuable things for things that are intrinsically valuable. Now, Margaret Thatcher said that it's easy to spend other people's money, but sooner or later it runs out. But that's not the case with God. After all, when we rob other people, God's no poorer. It's all his, no matter whose pocket it's in. Now, don't get me wrong, stealing is wrong, but that's because God cares about us, not because he's concerned about himself. The master in the story is God, not your employer. I know there are employers out there who are breathing a sigh of relief at this moment. But Jesus has more to say on the subject. Here are two short parables to consider. They're both found in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 13, verses 44 through 46. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. This time, the message isn't about house money, it's about your money and everything else you possess. And the point of both parables is there is one thing of supreme value that you should exchange everything else to possess. If you do, you'll be a wealthy man. If you don't, you'll be poorer for it. One more story. But this time, Jesus is in it rather than simply telling it. It's found in Luke's Gospel again, chapter 18, verses 18 through 23. A ruler asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, honor your father and mother." And he said, "All these I have kept from my youth." When Jesus heard this, he said to him, "One thing you still lack. Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me." But when he heard these things, he became very sad, for he was extremely rich. This is one of those moments when someone is trying to be polite and someone else uses it to make a point. Don't you hate that? And what's the point? There are at least two, the stated one and an implied one. The stated one is only God is good, meaning he is the only truly intrinsically valuable thing there is. If thing can be used for the word thing, for the one who created everything. And second, Jesus hints at his identity here and his worth. He's worth everything, which means what? He's God. So when it comes to valuable possessions in this world, whatever value they possess comes from God. Health, I think, is something that we all agree has intrinsic value. But where does that come from? Sure, diet and exercise, those are important. But you know what I mean. God grants it, along with everything else that's truly valuable, truly good. But there's another sense that even extrinsically valuable things owe their value to God. So let's take a look at that now. What can we exchange for things that have true value? Whatever it is, it can't be valuable in the same way intrinsically valuable things are. Making that sort of exchange would be foolish. But whatever it is, we will still need to believe it has some value, even if only extrinsically valuable, or extrinsically so. Now, again, I'm in territory here that preachers can pontificate on without apology. It's the subject of faith. We first learn to trust other people at home as small children. Children who are surrounded by people who can't be trusted have a difficult time trusting anyone, and can end up miserable in the end unless the grace of God comes to the rescue. But when it comes to households, I've spent at least 10 years thinking about them and writing about them. And here's something you probably already know. The two Greek words that we derive the English word economy from are oikos and nomos, and they put together mean the law of the house. In pre-modern households, members of a household shared the work and shared what they produced. It was closer to a gift-giving economy than a market economy, and in a way you could even say it was socialism, but socialism on the only scale that actually works. But even in those days, households made things for the market, and the trust that made cooperation possible in a household had to be extended in some way to the larger world. And this is where currency came in. The word currency also has a history. It's derived from the Latin cure, for to flow or to run, like a current of water or a current of electricity. But what's flowing in the market economy? We all know value is what's flowing. But what happens when we begin to lose faith in a currency? Perhaps we can reverse engineer how currencies lose value in order to recover how currencies become valuable in the first place. The film Casablanca is useful for thinking about this. And by the way, the title of this talk, I retitled it. What you have in the program is what I told Jordan I'd call it, but I've decided that it's now Welcome to Casablanca. In the Second World War, the refugees are fleeing Europe as the Nazis advance. Casablanca is in French Morocco, and while not formally subject to the Nazis, like a large swath of France, the future is uncertain and the local French authorities collaborate just in case. When it comes to the refugees, we see what they're willing to pay for freedom. The opening scenes at Rick's Café American shows them at tables exchanging whatever they can for letters of transit to Lisbon and ultimately the Americas, where freedom, at least used to be, honored. Since national currencies are compromised as countries fall to the Nazis, other things must serve as substitutes. At one table, a woman is offering a diamond necklace, and later in a poignant scene, another woman considers selling her body for freedom. But the story really revolves around the owner of Rick's Café American, played by Humphrey Bogart. He's tough and cynical and worldly wise and soft-hearted. Because he is wise as a serpent, yet innocent as a dove, he stands out. Everyone trusts him, even the villains in the film. There's something else that people trust in the film, though, and that's letters of transit. Anyone in possession of those has a ticket to freedom. A set signed by General de Gaulle himself happened to be in the possession of a character named Ugarte, played by the great character actor Peter Lorre. After killing 2 German couriers to get them, he asks Rick to hide them. In a marvelous exchange, Ugarte says, "Rick, you despise me, don't you?" Rick answers, "If I gave you any thought, I suppose I would." Ugarte responds, "Rick, I have many friends in Casablanca, but because you despise me, I trust you. You're the only one." So subtle, yet revealing. Ultimately, trust is the real currency. People we can trust, things we believe have value, in this case, letters of transit, these are the things that make an economy possible. I submit for your consideration that while the world feels at the moment like an episode of The Twilight Zone, we're actually living in something more like Casablanca. Fiat currencies are a peculiar form of currency. They're issued by governments, and the only thing standing behind them is a promise, or is it really a threat? Trust us. Obviously, in the case of the dollar, it's the United States government. But what if you don't trust a government or its currency? What if a government is taken over by a criminal gang, like the Nazis or the communists? What then? It's happened before. It could happen again. Some people think it's happening now. In Book 4 of City of God, Augustine tells a marvelous story about a pirate who had been seized and brought before Alexander the Great. This is from City of God. Quote, "Justice being taken away, then what are kingdoms but great robberies? For what are robbers themselves but little kingdoms? A band itself is made up of men. It is ruled by the authority of a prince. It is knit together by a pact of a confederacy. The booty is divided by the law agreed on. But if the admittance of abandoned men, or by the admittance of abandoned men, this evil increases to such a degree that it holds places, fixed abodes, takes possession of cities, and subdues people, it assumes more plainly the name kingdom, because the reality is now manifestly conferred upon it, not by the removal of covetousness, but by the addition of impunity. Indeed, that was an apt and true reply, which was given to Alexander the Great by a pirate who had been seized. For when that king asked the man what he meant by keeping hostile possession of the sea, he answered with bold pride, 'What thou meanest by seizing the whole earth. Because I do it with a petty ship, I am called a robber, whilst thou, who doth it with a great fleet, art styled an emperor.' Governments go bad, as any casual reading of history will tell you, and when they are no longer just, they're gangs of robbers. But at least at the start, the robberies are committed quietly, even bureaucratically. And one of the most insidious ways this happens is through the debasement of the currency. It's really stealth taxation. Governments go into debt just like you and me, but unlike you and me, they can print money to pay their bills. When they do that, the debt remains fixed, but the cost of money goes down. Well-connected people can do just fine when that happens, but people on fixed incomes, the ones who can least afford seeing their savings and income lose value, do very poorly. Fiat currencies being what they are and people being what they are, it seems almost inevitable for this sort of thing to come about or happen. Since they're not based on anything more substantial than the integrity of the government standing behind them, when a government goes bad, they go bad. To put it another way, their value is relative to the probity or the honesty or the integrity of the government. Is this the way it has to be, though? Can't we find another basis for a currency, something stable and difficult to debase? The book of Leviticus sets down this rule when it comes to justice. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor, which implies that we have the ability to judge righteously, that impartiality is not a pipe dream. We can actually do this. And judgment isn't limited to courts. Every day in the market, we exercise it. That's why just a few verses later, we're told, you shall do no wrong in judgment. In measures of length or weight or quantity, you shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, a just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, where I think the statement implies that was not the case. Historically, the gold standard was considered the best way to keep currencies trustworthy. Instead of a promise, there was something hard behind the currency. Those days are behind us. Most people blame Richard Nixon for overturning the gold standard in 1971, but its days were numbered anyway. It was already dealt a fatal wound by the innocuously named Bank Holiday Act of 1933. FDR was the real criminal. Because of the act, banks could no longer give you gold for dollars. Worse, everyone in possession of gold was forced to sell their gold to the U.S. Treasury at a discount. Then the dollars they were given were devalued by more than 30% shortly after that. So much for trust us. Today, when I talk to people, most of the time, they point to the scarcity of gold as the reason for the gold standard. It's because gold is scarce that it's a hedge against debasing the currency. And this is the same line of reasoning I hear being applied to Bitcoin. And while this is true, as far as it goes, is that all there is to it? I think there's something more to be said for both gold and Bitcoin. As I conclude, allow me to explain. There's something about gold that we intuitively know reflects heavenly things. It's beautiful, for one thing. It's heavy, for another. The Hebrew word for glory literally means heavy. And last of all, it doesn't tarnish or fade. And these are things that people in every culture have valued at every time in human history. The thing we can say for the minting of gold coins by governments is that we have their promises that the gold is pure, or at least as pure as is humanly possible. Now, can something similar be said for Bitcoin? Is there something to it that we can say is an analog to things divine, even though we can't see Bitcoin or hold it? I believe so, but it isn't as intuitive as gold. Instead, it's conceptual. And since most people can't write code and can't judge the beauty, say, of blockchain, its value will have to be demonstrated over time by early adopters, like us. But there's nothing new about that. Besides, heavenly things generally are invisible. I waited for years to get a smartphone, and then I realized at a certain point, I can't live in our society if I don't have one. So hopefully, Bitcoin will experience that same kind of sort of adoption curve. What makes Bitcoin an analog to heavenly things is its fixed and objective character, something that isn't subject to corruption in the same way as fiat currency. And it is that stability that reminds us of God's unchanging character. God isn't fickle or arbitrary or on the make. He's wise and consistent and just. As the Apostle James put it, there's no shadow of turning with him. If Bitcoin can demonstrate God-like probity while fiat currencies around the world rob people through inflation and debt manipulation, I think that even atheists will reluctantly find themselves thanking God for Bitcoin. But there is one more thing I'd like to say for Bitcoin, something obliquely mentioned a couple of times already, but I'd like to make clear. Fiat currencies can be used by governments and the banks they control to control you, as we saw demonstrated with the Canadian truckers. Suddenly, those hardworking people were denied access to what was rightfully theirs, their own money, simply because they protested government overreach. Isn't that ironic? Because Bitcoin isn't backed by governments, it can transcend governments and their territories, almost like God. Bitcoin, then, isn't just a hedge against inflation. Like those letters of transit, it could be a ticket to freedom. I hope so. I don't know enough. I'm here to learn myself over the next couple of days, but we'll see. Anyway, thank you. By the way, as I wrap things up here, I was given a quote from J. Gresham Machen in his response to the Bank Holiday Act of 1933. It's golden. It really is. I got it from Jordan. Jordan, if you could share that with everybody, I think that would be great.
You could read it.
I have time? Okay, sure. All right. I'll do that. So this is J. Gresham Machen, the man who wrote Christianity and Liberalism, and is the founder of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He was a professor at Princeton and was considered a kind of world-class intellectual. I think the really significant thing that we find is that America has turned away from God. In the political and social discussions of the day, God's law has ceased to be regarded as a factor that deserves to be reckoned with at all. That is true in regard to the higher ranges of human life. It is also true in regard to that mammon in which our Lord said a man must be faithful if he is to be faithful in higher things. We hear much about mammon today. We hear much about the currency. We hear much about the question whether what is euphemistically called, quote, managed currency is or is not economically more advantageous than the gold standard. But the sad thing is that in all this discussion, we hear little about simple honesty, which is the law of God. I can remember when I had a certain patriotic pride in the good faith of the United States government. In those bygone days when the phrase sound as a dollar had not become a jest. The United States government in its business dealings seemed to me to be the very embodiment of integrity. I regarded it as almost inconceivable that it would repudiate its corporate obligations. Yet, today, it has done just that. Of course, there are times when a government or an individual must fail to meet obligations. That is when the government or the individual is bankrupt. When the government or the individual acknowledges the justice of the obligations, but is under the necessity of pleading that they cannot be met, I'm not saying, therefore, that when a country goes off the gold standard, it is necessarily acting dishonestly, but it is not such an honest bankruptcy which we have in the United States at the present time. On the contrary, what we have is a very ruthless application of the devil's principle that might makes right. Look at the United States gold certificate, if you can find one somewhere in a museum today without being put in jail for looking at it. Upon it, the United States government promises to pay very specifically, not in some other currency, but in gold. It is a solemn obligation of the United States. It is a solemn contract, not of an individual, but of the United States government. A contract to the fulfillment of which the honor of the American people is pledged. A contract with the holder of the note. Today, not only is that contract not fulfilled, but the holder of the contract is threatened with imprisonment unless he hands over to the defaulting party the contract itself. I tell you, my friends, there are many things that are uncertain about the future, but one thing we can be sure of. A nation that tramples thus upon the law of God, that tramples upon the basic principles of integrity, is headed for destruction unless it repents in time. You know, the fascinating thing about that act in 1933 is I had never heard of it until recently. And I've spoken to financial people and accountants, and they hadn't heard of it either. I wonder why. Thanks.